What was your background about the investigative judgment before the talk at PUC?
I had read the Bible through by the age of 12 and kept reading it in the months and years that followed, but found there was nothing in either testament about the investigative judgment. But I was lent the book Great Controversy by Ellen G. White, and it influenced me greatly towards Adventism. I was an Anglican. It had much about the investigative judgment, and I did not realise that its content was largely from Uriah Smith and J.N. Andrews. I still regard that book as a spiritual classic, despite some historical mistakes and some theological errors. But its chapters on Luther and Huss and Jerome and Wesley are beautiful chapters. But it was the same year that in rereading Hebrews, particularly 6:19, 9:8, 9:12, 9:25, 10:19, I realised the Bible said that Christ went into the presence of God immediately on his ascension, not 1844. This was a problem to me. I loved the church. I was baptised when I was 16. So many good things in Adventism, which I still love. The Sabbath, which the Christian world has neglected, but which the New Testament proportionately mentions more times than the Old Testament. And Christ defended it by 7 miracles on the holy day. The Adventist teaching on the nature of man, so much better than hellfire. And there were other teachings, including the health message, which greatly appealed to me. But I was troubled when I found the book of Hebrews did not support the investigative judgment. And I spent 30 years trying to find a way out of that problem. I mentioned it to a number of people who were intelligent, who knew the Bible well, but the only one who had an answer was Pastor David Sibley, who was in charge of Trans-Tasman Union Conference. He says, Des, it's wrong. But there are lots of good things in Adventism, so don't give up on it just because of that error. So, though I mentioned it to a number of folks, no one else had any other answer. And I was still a very loyal Adventist when I went to PUC about 1977.
What did Pastor David Sibley say to you about his contact with the teachings of W. Fletcher?
I travelled all night with Pastor David Sibley after he had baptised some folks that had accepted Adventism through my evangelistic meetings. And again, I pressed him on the matter of the investigative judgment. He said the church appointed me in the 1930s to answer the main man who was against it in the Australasian division, a saintly man, a man whom everybody loved, by the name of W. Fletcher. I said, well, how did you get on? And Pastor Sibley said, I found he was right. I said, what? You, a president, you agree with Fletcher? Yes, said Sibley, he was right. But remember, there are many good things in Adventism, and every denomination has some problems. That was it.
Had you tried to talk to the top men in Adventism about the problem before you spoke at PUC?
I remember when Jill and I were in England and we met Elder Duncan Eva, a wonderfully fine Christian man and a splendid administrator. I had met other good administrators like Robert Frame and Elsie Naden, the Hollingsworth brothers, and some fine men in USA who were administrators. But Duncan Eva was very special. And I talked to him about the problem in Hebrews. He rather represented the number of folk to whom I expressed my problem, but he had no answer. But I loved him.
You knew many of the chief SDA scholars. What was their attitude to the investigative judgment? For example, Fritz Guy and Fred Veltman.
Seventh-day Adventist scholars have known for almost a century the investigative judgment is not biblical. That's why it was not taught at Andrews, till I told Elder Wilson that no one there had heard about it for years. When Fritz Guy, teaching at Andrews, was asked about the investigative judgment, he said it is as true as the story of the man in the moon. In later years, I spoke to Fritz myself, and I said, isn't this doctrine actually ridiculous? He paused, and then he said slowly, yes, it is. Fred Veltman for years had known the investigative judgment was wrong. I think it was he who told this to Dale Ratzlaff long years before. And he approached Neil Wilson at the time of Glacier View, and he said, I'm with Des. I do not believe the investigative judgment. Elder Wilson said, that's okay, but don't go public. Well, I'm mixed with a number of other scholars. I can only think of one or two still trying to hold on to investigative judgment. The rest of them had thrown it out. And the same is true of scholarly men in the Australasian division, whom I knew very well indeed.
Were you pleased that Glacier View took place?
I was very pleased that Glacier View took place. For 30 years, by voice and pen, I had tried to draw the attention of the church, a church I love deeply and still love. I tried to draw the attention of the church and failed. I was very glad about Glacier View. What I had discovered at 15 years of age, I was able to present to 1,000 people at the PUC forum. And then I was asked to write a document, and I wrote nearly 1,000 pages to try and cover all the traditional rebuttals, all of which I knew very well indeed. So I was pleased about Glacier View because my manuscript would now go all over the Adventist world. I was rather sorry to learn that most people at Glacier View didn't have time to read the manuscript, though they had been told, don't come unless you've read it. But Ray Cottle assured me that as he mixed with the people there, he hadn't found people who'd read it at all. But I was very pleased. Glacier View cost me my vocation as a Bible teacher, which I loved. I had prayed for it since I was 15, and God had led me to it. And I spent many years teaching at Avondale and about 2 years at PUC. Later I was to teach at Trinity Evangelical Seminary. So the loss of my vocation hurt. But after that, I went to many countries. Jill and I were in England, and I was in Ireland. Jill and I were in Norway, Sweden. I preached the gospel in many countries, including Russia and the places I have mentioned. And the main cities of America I went to repeatedly. I did not preach on the investigative judgment. I've taken thousands of meetings since Glacier View, literally thousands, but I have not ever chosen to speak on investigative judgment unless specially urged by some group, which has happened 3 or 4 times. It happened at Loma Linda and it happened in Sydney, but as a rule I don't speak on it at all. Yes, I'm very glad about Glacier View. The investigative judgment is now dead. A GC friend who made arrangements to see me when he came over this country, he said, we don't preach it over there anymore. There are a few extremely traditional people trying to hold on to it, but people that read, people that study the Bible have given it up. We thank God for that, because now those who are untrammeled by this non-biblical teaching can have Christian assurance. They can know they're right with God, that they've got the verdict of the last judgment today. Read 1 John, it says it over and over. We know we are the children of God. Adventists can now know, because the obstacle, the terrible obstacle of the investigative judgment, which was the fifth invention of the church to try and explain 1844, it's now dead.
Talk about your interaction with Neil Wilson at the meetings and...
Pastor Neil Wilson, Elder Wilson, was a very gifted, talented, intelligent man. He could be very kind, friendly, charming, but he was first of all an administrator. Coincidentally, yesterday I read a famous book written by Dr. Marcus Dodds on the parables. And I happened to read yesterday, he said there's a great danger for men in the position of the church that's high and lofty, that they can begin to run the church like a business. And Dodds spoke at length about it. And I have to confess that Neil Wilson faced that temptation. Whether he fully succumbed to it, only God knows. He was very gifted. I've heard him speak at considerable length and say nothing. That's very difficult to do. But he was a man that could make friends easily and lose them easily. At the time of the Davenport scandal, top men wept before Wilson. You know, all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I'm not Wilson's judge. He spoke to me very strongly and very unkindly in front of the whole group of the Glacier View people. One well-known scholar went out of the hall weeping, and other scholars felt like that. His last years he suffered from dementia, but so do many saints. I commit him to God, and I'm pleased that he called for Glacier View. He could have said, Des, you go back to canvassing. I was a colporteur in the 1950s. I would have missed it for $1,000, and I wouldn't go through it again for $1 million. But he could have said, Des, we're throwing a blanket over this. You've made an administrative error in telling the children about this matter. Back you go to canvassing. But he didn't. He called a worldwide gathering. And so now the topic is well nigh dead.
What was your main concern about the Friday afternoon meeting with Prexad and others? What was not recorded in their notes?
It is my opinion, having heard Jill's talks about the Friday afternoon, it is my opinion that many things I said were never recorded. But that's not my main problem. There were men there I trusted implicitly. Arthur Duffy, you wouldn't find a better man than Arthur Duffy. Duncan Eva was there. Spangler was my friend, though he was a company man. But my main objection was these men were finding fault with a manuscript they'd not read, a manuscript that had been supported in its key areas by the consensus statement, which they buried. They never brought it up on the Friday afternoon. It's never been brought up since because it agreed with my manuscript in 12 key areas. So my main concern on the Friday afternoon, here were men who probably had never given 30 minutes to the problems associated with Daniel 8:14, and they were judging me who'd given 30 years of minute and thorough attention to the problem, trying to find a way out for the church. And I did find a way out. And I mentioned it at the close of my PUC forum meeting. You know, that's now in a little book that you can get from Amazon, and you'll see I gave the church a way out. But these men on Friday afternoon, some of them saints, but ignorant saints, that was a sorrow to me. This little book will be of interest to some of you. It gives a word-for-word transcript of the talk I gave at the PUC forum. And there are some interesting comments also from Dr. Ray Cottrell, who in his day was the best scholar Adventism had. The book can be gotten from Amazon, quite inexpensive.
Des, among the things that they said on the Friday afternoon meeting at the beginning, they made you out to be a very bad boy indeed. And they said through the meeting at times, they kept on saying how you had taken things out of context.
Oh, I'll be glad to talk about that.
Talk to us about the pre-meetings of Glacier View with that.
One of the 10 points used against me, the key to my expulsion, was that in my manuscript I'd taken some quotations out of context. This was the belief of Arthur Furch, or at least he expressed it, but he was never able to give me an example, and no one ever has. There is nothing out of context in that very large book, which summarised 30 years of research, including research at the Library of Congress in USA. On that Friday afternoon, the brethren repeatedly accused me of a number of things that they had heard as rumours and were not true. Parmenter had told them that I was in collusion with Bob Rinsmead. That was never true. It is true Bob tried to get me on his side after Glacier View, but I refused. I was accused of quoting out of context. No one has ever been able to demonstrate that accusation. Now, of course, I'm a long way from being a perfect saint, and I'm quite sure that there are times when my selfish spirit has failed to speak in a perfect Christian manner. But this I can say, I've taken about 30,000 talks, 30,000, including classes, radio, television, sermons, and the main objective in every one of those talks was to bring people to the gospel of Christ. That I can confess, though I am indeed a very faulty individual.
Have well-known scholars in Australia spoken of their opinions on this issue? Didn't two people do a PhD on the topic?
Yes, Australian scholars in teaching, I don't know how much in preaching, but in teaching, have admitted the problems found in Hebrews chapter 6, chapter 9 and chapter 10, which clearly state Christ went within the second veil, into the Holy of Holies, into the presence of God at his ascension, not 1844. Two of those men have done their PhD dissertations on this subject. I have those dissertations, though one of them, among 7,000 books, may be difficult to find. The other I could put my hand on immediately. And I know of scholars now who are important in the Australasian division who know and confess that we were altogether wrong about 1844. I could name them, but I don't think that would be a Christian thing to do.
How has your life been since Glacier View? Have you lost many friends?
I thank God for his mercies. I'm not aware of losing any real friends. And Jill and I have friends all over the world. You have to remember I've been in over 40 countries, and in all those countries, or in most of them, there's someone I've taught somewhere along the way. So by the mercy of God, Jill and I have not lost real friends, and we have an innumerable company of friends today. My life since Glacier View has been very, very busy, perhaps too busy, a risk to health. But I've had excellent health till 2015. Excellent health until then, and then an accident from years earlier triggered surgical repairs and led to a stroke and to infection and to hospitalisation, and one doctor thought I was going to die. But I have comparatively good health despite a torn meniscus in the knee. There are many things which I would like to do better. I am a terrible writer because I write with the left hand, and it's not only left hand, it's backwards and it's bad. I'm a terrible writer. I'm not naturally tidy. If you visit me in my study, you'll see books and papers everywhere. I'm sure I don't love people as much as I should, but I do pray regularly that God will make me more like my Lord Jesus Christ. Since Glacier View, he has cared for Jill and me in a wonderful way. Americans wouldn't let us come back to Australia. They wanted to form Good News Unlimited. So hundreds of meetings were taken in America for those people, in all the big cities of America, over and over and over again. And then I spoke on 26 radio stations. I spoke on television for months. From time to time, I went to Trinity Evangelical Seminary and taught there. God has been very good to us. It's been a very full life. Jill has been such a helper. She's done many things I could not do. She's naturally very practical, whereas I'm bigger in theory than in practice. So I've had a good wife, a good life, and a Christ who is always near. I have everything to thank God for.
How did Neil Wilson and Robert Falkenberg treat you after Glacier View? I'm talking about the visits of the PUC clergy from time to time.
We had visitors, Jill and I, from PUC pastors from time to time, because Neil Wilson had put pressure on them to get rid of us from the church, which they refused to do. Ultimately, when we're coming back to Australia, we thought it was the honest thing to do to remove our membership from PUC. We did it despite requests from PUC people, don't do it. But we didn't think it was honest to keep our names on the roll there when we're going to be in Australia. Neil Wilson and probably Falkenberg, I don't know all that Falkenberg did, except he did a number of things that rendered him a very guilty man indeed. But we do know that Neil Wilson was led by Keith Parmenter to organise a meeting that would remove my credentials after 1983. Duncan Eva and Spangler told Jill and me that Parmenter had been pushing Neil Wilson to get rid of my credentials one way or another, and Neil Wilson did it.